So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Shirk. I have the privilege of chairing the 21st Century China Center here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, UC San Diego. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th annual Robert Ellsworth Memorial Lecture. And we're very honored to have Prime Minister Kevin Rudd with us to deliver the lecture today. I want to say a little bit about Bob Ellsworth because he, sometimes when you have these memorial lectures, they're a name and they're not a real memory of a person to most of the people in the audience, but to many of us here, Robert Ellsworth was our friend and mentor, advisor, inspiration, certainly a major inspiration and guide for the establishment of the 21st Century China Center, and we're very grateful for that. Ambassador Ellsworth passed away in 2011. He was a congressman, three-term congressman from Kansas, a Republican. He served as Nixon's political director in the successful 1968 presidential campaign, served as assistant to the president. Then he was U.S. ambassador to NATO and later Deputy Secretary of Defense. So he was a politician, statesman, in something not necessarily in the same order as the Kevin Rudd mode. He had a great internationalist and global vision of the world and was a great patriot. And we were very fortunate to have him move to San Diego, much as, some of you in the audience who lived elsewhere for much of your lives then came to San Diego. We really are the beneficiary of all the wisdom and experience and enthusiasm that people like Bob Ellsworth bring to our community. So we're grateful to Li Jungyuan, a supporter of the 21st Century China Center and a member of the advisory board of the School of Global Policy and Strategy, for his sponsorship of the Ellsworth Memorial Lectureship. Unfortunately, he was not able to be with us today, but we do have Eleanor Ellsworth, our friend and Bob's wife, here to say a few words about him. Eleanor.
Good afternoon. Isn't this a wonderful auditorium? It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you. That is my honor that I get to do today, is to welcome each and every one of you, especially our distinguished and, may I add, delightful speaker, whom Susan will introduce more fully in a few minutes. It's also an opportunity for me to say thank you. Thank you to the people who support in myriad ways the institution of the 21st Century China Center. And I include in that the faculty and the students, because without the faculty and the students, there would be no center and there would be no activity. It is really a remarkable school, and under the leadership of Peter Cowie and Professor Susan Shirk and Lei Guang, this institution is thriving, and I can tell you for a fact that Bob would be thrilled to know that this vision that was envisioned, a number of years ago now, is vibrant, and it is important, and we are very fortunate to have all the activity that happens here, especially great speakers as we have today. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to all of you again. Susan, you want to come up here and introduce our speaker. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here.
Well, it's really a great privilege to have Kevin Rudd with us today to deliver the Ellsworth Memorial Lecture. We've been eager to have him here to speak at 21st Century China Center for quite a number of years. He has a very busy, peripatetic life as really a citizen of the world. Of course, you all know that he was Australia's 26th Prime Minister. He also served as Australia's Foreign Minister, but we in the China field know him as one of our most highly respected scholars and thinkers on China. He served as a diplomat. He studied China and Chinese, and then he served as an Australian diplomat before he entered politics. And I've been learning a little bit more about what he did as prime minister as well, and his accomplishments were really amazing. He was right in the middle and one of the major architects of the global response to the global financial crisis. He helped develop and found the G20. He also was a real important leader at the Paris meeting on climate change in 2007 and 2009, Copenhagen Climate Change Summit, and has, since leaving elected office, he has mostly been living in New York, but traveling widely, and is engaged in a number, in fact, leading a number of very important international initiatives to strengthen the global order in all its dimensions, strengthen multilateral approaches to conflict prevention, and developing global cooperation on meeting the needs of people around the world. So he really is today a global statesman. What I didn't mention is his actual day job, I guess you would say, which is that he is the president of the Asia Society Policy Institute based in New York, but Asia Society has offices and activities really around the world, including on the West Coast. And Asia Society has been a great partner to the 21st Century China Center in our task force on U.S. China policy and a number of other activities. So it's a great treat, a great honor to welcome Kevin Rudd to speak with us today.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the warm words of welcome. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit like Mae West today. Mind you, I was always a big fan of Mae West, and her doctrine of politics was something which always appealed to me, which is it's always better to be looked over than overlooked. But I have flown in from Beijing last night, and somewhere between Riyadh and Saudi Arabia and Beijing, I caught the lurgy. So that's why my voice is not its usual resonant self. So my apologies. Susan, thank you for the kind introduction. It's good to be back here in San Diego, and to acknowledge the great work that you and this center do as we all wrestle with this extraordinarily complex subject of understanding contemporary China and what contemporary China means for the rest of us. This is not easy. If you're a student of the New Testament, I always use the analogy of St. Paul. That is, understanding China is like staring through a glass dimly. We understand the shapes that are moving there. Sometimes it's a little difficult to understand the precise nature of those shapes, given the opacity of the Chinese political system. And to Eleanor Ellsworth, who I've just met, thank you so much for your warm words of introduction as well. And it is important that we honour your husband's contribution to American public life. Being in public life is not easy, not in any of our democracies. And his contribution to American public life goes with the respect and affection of us all. I'm going to speak to you for 30, or they say the outside 40 minutes, on this subject. And then we'll have a conversation among us. I've entitled the lecture a little differently to what is on the board, mainly because I wrote it last night on the flight from Beijing to Los Angeles. And once I got to the third glass of Johnny Walker, it came a little more fluidly. To decouple or not to decouple, that is the question of U.S. China relations. The casual, almost nonchalant, and for some of us deeply satisfying deployment of the word decoupling in the midst of the current fetid state of U.S. China relations is a reminder of the ancient wisdom that in foreign policy, words are indeed bullets. That's despite the fact that neither the United States nor the Chinese government at this stage are deploying the D word, that's decoupling, as part of the official vocabulary of the bilateral relationship, despite the fact that this relationship, the U.S.-China relationship, is in the worst shape, I believe, in half a century. Official reluctance, however, has not prevented the term being thrown around with reckless abandon by the commentariat in both capitals, with varying levels of semi-official enthusiasm, but I fear with greater and greater levels of contagion. It was only 18 months ago that this word was first used. And it was only 18 months ago that we first became accustomed to the words trade war between China and the United States. But by the end of last year, this had happily morphed into a technology war. And by the early months of this year, these had morphed in turn to this much wider language of economic decoupling, covering trade, technology, talent, foreign direct investment, capital markets more generally, and as of last week, national currency strategy as well. A year is indeed a long time in global politics. And whereas once upon a time, we measured systemic changes over periods of decades, we now discover that a year or a year and a half in global politics sounds like and feels like an eternity. This debate about decoupling reminds us afresh that geopolitical and geoeconomic change, including reaction to that change, is now so rapid that it defies the ability of political and policy elites to remain abreast of what is actually happening out there in the so-called real world, let alone what we should then do about it. It reminds us also that in international relations, language can both reflect realities just as easily as it can create realities in that same real world. And it also reminds us that sharp language, when it's used ahead of the curve or in advance of the reality which it seeks to describe, can generate contingency plans in both capitals where there is an ever-present danger of those plans then being activated just in case, creating in turn a cycle of action and reaction eventually spiraling out of control. I fear we may be at such a juncture right now. It reminds me a little of the mobilization plans, schedules and railway timetables of the great powers on the eve of the First World War, albeit now in the wider, but now potentially lethal domains of the economy. My purpose in this lecture today is threefold. First, to analyse the domestic and foreign policy context in which this great debate on the great decoupling has taken off. Second, to look carefully at trade, foreign investment, technology, talent and capital markets to test whether we are actually witnessing a substantive decoupling or something much more mixed than that. And third, what do we conclude from the above, given that economic decoupling affects the world of foreign policy and national security policy as well, and indeed our wider geopolitical stability for the future? My argument is simple, that those supporting comprehensive decoupling in both capitals are seeking to create the conditions precedent for a substantive rather than a rhetorical second Cold War. If you take the economy out of the equation, and there is no further substantive economic engagement between America and China, you are therefore much more easily on the cusp of what could be called another Cold War. My second argument is that despite all of this, and despite this language, and despite those who might support it both in Beijing and in Washington, the present and prospective economic relationship is much more complex than the increasingly wild use of the term decoupling might suggest. And third, that policymakers in both capitals would be better advised to define afresh the terms of economic coexistence within the framework of what the United States has already defined as this new era of strategic competition, rather than indulging in the loose language of what could well become a self-fulfilling decoupling prophecy. So let's turn to the question of political and foreign policy context. The current debate on economic decoupling between the US and China occurs within a much wider political context. Much as economists would love to ignore politics, the reality is that it's the evolving nature of the domestic political economy of the US-China relationship that is likely to remain the lodestar of that relationship for the future. And it's this political and economic question that goes to the heart of the decoupling debate. The reality today is that the US-China relationship plays deeply into the domestic politics of each country. It is no longer a sacred space where only professional diplomats are allowed to operate. Politicians in both capitals, Republicans and Democrats in Washington, conservatives and reformers in Beijing, now rampage around the public debate on this relationship because it is now seen legitimately as central to everything. From soybeans to the South China Sea to climate change, from Huawei to the NBA to human rights, and also to almost every point in between. In the United States, the current president tries to sit above all this, claiming his Chinese counterpart is his best buddy, while at the same time declaring that China has now become America's public enemy number one. Make sense of that. Underneath the president, following the removal of National Security Advisor Bolton, the center of gravity on China policy has now moved to Secretary of State Pompeo, who's made it plain through the first of what he intends to be a series of thematic addresses on China that, and I quote, "China is truly hostile to the US and its values," unquote. The Pentagon voice under its new secretary on China at this stage remains largely unknown. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin seeks to pour oil on troubled waters wherever he can to try and calm markets, re-energize global growth, and sustain the American economy through the election year that will be 2020. While USTR Lighthizer is doing as professional a job as he can, staying carefully within his negotiating remit to try and bring the trade war to a satisfactory conclusion, one which maximizes China's policy change, while also minimizing the future bilateral trade deficit, recognizing that the latter, that's the trade deficit, remains his president's principal interest. It is not unusual for such disparate views on China to be present within a single administration. What is unusual is for these differences to be played out so publicly and so regularly, and for the President to exhibit such personal volatility on a relationship so fundamental to long-term US strategic and economic interests. Of course, the Republicans represent the sound of only one hand clapping on China. The Democrats have doubled down just as much. In fact, probably more so. Democrats have always exhibited greater skepticism than Republicans on China, both on trade and human rights. To this, they have now added technology and national security, as well as a political determination, mindful of the presidential election campaign that lies ahead, to depict any deal that President Trump may wish to make with Xi Jinping in trade or technology or the rest of the economic relationship as, by definition, insufficient and therefore a political sellout. Beyond these political postures, however, 3 years into this administration, it is still not clear what the actual content of US China strategy is. America is angry about China because it believes China has cheated on adopting WTO rules to its international trade and wider economic practices. America is frustrated with China because of what it sees as a series of broken promises to reform. And America feels betrayed by China, in its view, having extended WTO membership to Beijing on trust, and to see that trust in large part dishonoured when China decided instead to set out eating America's economic, technological, and then strategic lunch. But while America clearly has an attitude about China, it's not clear at this stage that Washington right now has an agreed strategy for dealing with China. In reaching tentative conclusions on what US strategy might be, it's important to look at the US National Security Strategy document of November 2017, the US Defense Strategy document of 2018, and other keynote speeches by both Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo. The US Defense Strategy defined China for the first time as a peer competitor of the United States. That is a major new development. The National Security Strategy has concluded that 40 years after strategic engagement with China began, that strategic engagement has failed because China, in America's view, has failed to adhere to the global rules-based order, let alone China becoming an effective advocate for the future of the order, and that therefore a new period of strategic competition is now underway. In other words, America is saying, no more Mr. Nice Guy, always giving China the benefit of the doubt. All that is over. But still, my argument is this is analysis rather than policy. Secretary Pompeo's address to the Hudson Institute on 30 October, just a few days ago, provides greater insight into the likely direction of US-China's strategy in the future. It is a remarkably blunt speech. I'd commend it to all of you. Indeed, various strategic hardheads in Beijing may welcome its bluntness as a clarification of the breadth of the administration's strategic intent. The heart of the Pompeo speech is an explicit American rejection of China's ideological system. Indeed, he states that China's Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist party, quote, focused on struggle and international domination, unquote. This language has not been used by any US administration in relation to China for half a century. The Secretary stops short of calling for regime change, although he does go on to say that he wants to see a liberalized China. And when China sees that language, they will read that as a call for regime change. Secretary Pompeo underlines that in the administration's policy that China's economic practices contravene competitive neutrality and that these must be confronted. So too must China's efforts through China's bilateral and multilateral diplomacy to change the international rules-based order be confronted, as must China's domestic human rights practices now being confronted. Secretary Pompeo admits that the administration is still, and I quote him again, trying to work out the right strategy and tactics to deliver against these objectives, unquote, but that this task will be the central task now of the United States of America, quote, for the next 50 to 100 years, unquote. I've been in politics for a while. It's a hard-hitting speech. Indeed, it embraces much of the language of the Cold War of a previous era. But for the purposes of my topic at this university today, what is important is what Secretary Pompeo does not embrace explicitly in this speech, which is any explicit support for any form of economic decoupling of the two economies. That language is missing from the speech. Indeed, this is made clear, even clearer, in Vice President Pence's speech at the Ellsworth Memorial Lecture the week before, when Pence stated, quote, "We are asked whether the Trump administration seeks to decouple from China. The answer is a resounding no." Pence went on to say that, quote, "Nor does the United States seek confrontation with China," unquote, a point which was explicitly re-emphasized by Pompeo a week later. The Chinese are likely to draw two conclusions from these remarks: that the US is unlikely to embark on a military strategy with China that runs the real risk of armed confrontation, and, more relevant for our purposes here today, that economic decoupling is not formally on the administration's agenda, at least for now. The open question, of course, is whether Beijing accepts either of these assurances at face value, given that there has been now a complete collapse in political and strategic confidence in bilateral undertakings of all hues by either side over the last couple of years. So much for Washington. What about Beijing? This brings us to the prevailing political context of China itself, where the Communist Party has just concluded the long-awaited fourth plenum of the 19th Central Committee. The only credible way to interpret the plenum communique is that Xi Jinping continues to reign supreme. Despite multiple rumours about the possible elevation of would-be replacements for both Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang at the 20th Congress in 2022, nothing of this type has happened at the plenum, thereby conveying a clear message that Xi intends to be in harness for the long term. This was reinforced by the fact that the communique was almost an exclusively political and ideological document, reinforcing Xi's determination to reassert the party's control over everything in China. Indeed, I would not be surprised if we soon see a dramatic resuscitation of the party's anti-corruption campaign of recent memory, in order to remind wavering comrades of what may await them should they be tempted to stray from party discipline. There has certainly been grumbling within the party about Xi Jinping overreach, on the concentration of individual power in Xi's hands itself, on the alienation of China's private sector and the resultant slowing of economic growth, on the U.S. China trade war, on the South China Sea, on China's 2025 strategy for dominating high technology in the decade ahead, on the cost and the reaction to the Belt and Road Initiative, on the reassertion of the party over the state and indeed over the market, and finally, most importantly at all, on the elimination of term limits for the presidency itself. But none of this has so far reached critical political mass. And Xi Jinping, as a political dialectician from central casting, who prides himself on his well-honed ability to anticipate action, reaction, and further reaction, almost 3 steps ahead of anybody else, seems to have anticipated the emerging criticism of his leadership and has begun acting decisively to deal with any difficulties well in advance. While continuing for a third 5-year term in 2022 will be a challenge, at this stage it remains the most probable outcome. In fact, my judgment is that Xi Jinping intends to remain as China's supreme political leader well into the 2030s. Xi's principal vulnerability remains the economy. Growth is slowing. Private sector business confidence remains low. Private entrepreneurs still see little reason to invest in the future because of uncertain signals on the future of the market economy, how big they will be allowed to grow, their ability to expatriate profits, the continued impact of the deleveraging campaign, an unlevel playing field with state-owned enterprises, both in market share and in credit allocation. Despite efforts 12 months ago to change course in an important speech to the nation's leading entrepreneurs on 1 November 2018, there is little evidence to date that the tax and credit policies announced since then have flowed through effectively to China's private sector. Sustaining 6% growth, therefore, remains a real problem for China. And Xi's critics will note carefully that the Fourth Plenum document paid scant attention to the real elephant in the national living room, that is, the economy. Indeed, it will be read by some as a triumph of politics over economics at a critical time for the country. This, then, is the domestic political and economic context in which Xi Jinping now confronts the rhetoric and/or the reality of economic decoupling from the United States. Xi faces three broad strategic alternatives on the economy, given the current fragility of global, regional and national growth. The first, to revisit his 1 November 2018 speech encouraging the private sector by doubling down again on measures to enhance new investment and employment. Unlikely. Second, he can make even greater recourse to fiscal and to a lesser extent monetary policy stimulus to fill the growing growth gap. China has headroom to do so, but not infinite headroom without generating other asset bubbles, financial imbalances, and systemic risks for the economy at large. Third, he can limit his exposure to additional externally generated risks to the economy by adopting a general strategy of greater international economic diversification beyond America, together with greater national economic self-reliance. Again, in my judgment, likely. Xi Jinping has learned not to trust what Donald Trump says. That is likely to mean not believing the recent assurances of his Vice President and Secretary of State that the administration has no interest in pursuing a decoupling strategy with China. Indeed, Xi Jinping believes the U.S. has fundamentally changed course towards China since 2017. Xi Jinping reportedly told his Politburo colleagues in a closed session earlier this year that the party should prepare itself for 30 years of sustained struggle with the United States, and that this will involve multiple provocations from America over that time. If this analysis is correct, where it leads us is a conclusion that Xi Jinping has now embarked on an accelerated campaign to insulate China to the greatest extent possible from future possible American coercive action against Beijing, and to do so across the full breadth of China's economic armory. The irony of this thesis is that whereas the Trump administration may indeed be genuine when it says it doesn't want to embark on economic decoupling with China, it may well be Xi Jinping's administration that initiates and accelerates the process in the name of national self-reliance. China has a long and celebrated tradition of what is called 自力更生, national self-reliance. And those of us who follow China closely have noted with some alarm the fact that this old slogan from pre-reform and opening days has made a loud reappearance in China's political vocabulary since the first shots of the trade war were fired some 18 months ago. It's a separate question, of course, whether going down the self-reliance road would be in China's national economic interests. Most of us, together with most Chinese economic reformers, would answer with a resounding no. But a sense of vulnerability does strange things to people, just as it does strange things to states, particularly if China were to combine greater self-sufficiency on the one hand with a radical new and accommodating international posture towards China's non-American friends and partners around the world. As China also seeks to offset its vulnerabilities with America in other countries, with export markets, technology markets, talent markets, foreign direct investment, capital markets, by seeking new strategic economic alliances in Europe, with Japan, with Korea, with India, with Southeast Asia, as well as some of China's more significant BRI partners, Belt and Road Initiative partners. But we should, before we embark further on this analysis, reflect on what, in fact, decoupling means in each of the principal areas of economic engagement between China and the United States. We should be mindful also of the law of unintended consequences. If decoupling is embraced in trade or in other domains, then what consequences flow, both in the rest of the real economy, but also in terms of wider political and strategic relations? In my remaining minutes today, let me reflect therefore briefly on 6 domains: the trade war, then what's happening with foreign direct investment, and then what is happening in technology, and then what is happening with capital markets, before concluding on currency and talent. I will summarise the arguments so as not to take an excessive amount of time today. For those of you interested in the more detailed arguments, there'll be a printed text of this lecture available in several days' time. On the trade war, my argument would be this: China, under no circumstances, wishes to decouple in terms of its current trading relationship with the United States. From China's perspective, it's simply too big and too important. The numbers speak for themselves. They do anticipate that there will be greater restrictions in the technology trade, which in terms of the future of the semiconductor trade, particularly from firms based here in the great state of California, will be of significance. China's interest is to settle the current trade war as rapidly as possible. It's having too big an effect in terms of domestic business confidence to be left alone. Therefore, phase 1 of the trade war, or phase 1 of the proposed agreement, which President Trump has spoken about most recently, is likely to find conclusion sometime before the end of this year, probably before Thanksgiving later this month. However, having said that, it is probably the simplest part of the overall disagreement to reach resolution on. The President of the United States has indicated that that element of the trade war that he sees early agreement on is China's agreement to purchase large-scale American agricultural products. On top of that, for an agreement to be reached on intellectual property protection, and for some new agreement to be made possible in terms of the management of currency volatility between the two countries. These matters should be relatively easy to reach a landing point on. The harder questions, however, have been deferred to so-called phase 2 of a resolution to the trade war. Included within that is the much more fundamental and systemic question of what happens with the future of Chinese state subsidy for Chinese firms operating in the global marketplace. The bottom line there is that China will be reluctant to move because it goes to the absolute heart of China's political and economic model. Nonetheless, there is sufficient economic interest on the Chinese side, and I believe on the American side going into a presidential election year, to find a landing point on phase 2 of the so-called trade agreement as well, possibly in the first quarter of next year. The bottom line, therefore, is despite the noise about decoupling in trade, and despite the fact that trade volumes between both countries have been affected by the current trade war, there is a deep interest on both sides to in fact ensure that this does not lead to a shattering in the trade relationship. On foreign direct investment, we see a more complex picture emerge. Foreign direct investment flows between both countries are not significant in absolute quantitative terms. What we have noticed, however, since the beginning of the trade war is that foreign direct investment flows from China to the United States have slowed to a virtual trickle in the last year or two. The current state of the relationship between China and the United States, as well as changes to CFIUS laws and other regulatory regimes in Washington for dealing with Chinese inbound investment, have obviously had an effect, but also other reasons have been at work as well, including the restrictions which China has imposed on its overall national investment strategy abroad, and the controls which it has imposed on its own capital account flexibility in accommodating the interests of its foreign investors. Putting these things together, we have seen the Chinese foreign direct investment numbers into the United States decline rapidly. Interestingly, despite the trade war, and despite the general debate on economic decoupling, the overall flow of American foreign direct investment into the United States, American flow of foreign direct investment into China, has held up to recent annual averages. Therefore, if we're looking for clear evidence of decoupling unfolding, at this stage in foreign direct investment flows, yes, there has been an impact in terms of flows into the United States, but not yet in the reverse direction. If we go to technology, this is beginning to reflect a much deeper fundamental change. On technology, the two premier debates are, of course, those which relate to the future of 5G and, more broadly, the future of artificial intelligence. This is where we, whether we like it or not, are seeing decoupling unfold. We are now looking at the reality of there being not just two worlds as far as internet governance is concerned, but likely to be two worlds as far as the technology and future governance of 5G telecommunications are concerned as well. In artificial intelligence, the acute sensitivities which are attached to the future of the semiconductor trade between the United States and China is also going to come under increasing pressure. Therefore, on artificial intelligence, where Xi Jinping's strategy, as articulated in the AI strategy of 2017, to achieve maximum AI, national self-reliance and global dominance through the course of the 2020s, is going to result in China increasingly looking to its own devices to achieve autonomy to the greatest extent that it can in artificial intelligence. Where the rubber will hit the road, however, in this particular domain is in semiconducting technology itself, where China still lags at least 5 years behind. In the case of certain categories of chips, it is a more variable picture. China in certain categories of computer chips is reasonably advanced. In other categories, less so. China's determination, however, is to ensure that as they see the technology doors to the United States begin to close, that they wish to be in a position to maximize their own drive towards national self-reliance, and simultaneously to pursue collaborative partnerships with institutions and research institutions in both Europe and in Japan, which can offset any future lack of access to American technology markets. Therefore, against the general matrix that we're looking at in the context of this lecture on the future of decoupling, technology is where decoupling is happening most. If we turn to capital markets represent a more complex reality again. Here, the stakes alive in the future openness of capital markets in both directions are huge. The current U.S. China bilateral financial relationship, all categories included, covers just over US dollars 5 trillion. That's a lot of money. This includes Chinese listings on US stock exchanges, 1.9 trillion. It includes 1.5 trillion in Chinese stocks and bond holdings. It also includes 1.1 trillion in Chinese official holdings of US treasuries. It includes a range of other mutual exposures as well. The numbers involved in both China and the United States in their capital markets engagement with each other are of an order of magnitude that the interest in both countries to allow any significant decoupling to occur in capital markets will push in the reverse direction. Of course, that has not prevented pressures emerging in the United States to do precisely that. Those of us familiar with the debate in Washington will be very familiar with the legislation being initiated by Senator Rubio and others concerning the so-called Equitable Act, and also the proposal which deals with the future of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board in order to impose restrictions in the United States on US public pension funds investing in certain Chinese firms. However, it remains to be seen whether those particular legislative initiatives are going to pass either the Senate or the House or survive any possible presidential veto. Nonetheless, my overall submission is this, that the sheer dimensions of the capital markets' interest in both countries are cautioning both sides of this decoupling debate in the United States and in China to think twice and thrice about the wisdom of proceeding further in this direction. In the meantime, China itself is opening its capital markets even further, and this is driven by a deep and underlying Chinese concern about the need to finance its own prospective current account deficit by the time they reach the end of 2019 or into 2020. For those reasons, we've seen China, for example, open the extent to which foreigners can invest in Chinese equities, the extent to which foreigners and from established institutions can invest in the Chinese debt market, as well as China, for the first time, allowing wholly owned foreign enterprises to enter into the Chinese insurance and brokerage markets, also pointing to wider reforms in the overall liberalisation of Chinese financial services industry. My overall argument today, therefore, is we look at capital markets. The interests are huge, both from China and from the United States. Secondly, China has a particular interest because of its net financing requirement as it enters into a current account deficit for the first time in a quarter of a century to keep its arteries to global finance well and truly open. And on top of that, while we do note that there are political pressures emerging in Washington through Senator Rubio and others to act in a reverse direction, that it's not clear to me at this stage that there is a large political constituency in support of that. Finally, currency. By and large, this has been a debate which is focused on exchange rate movements between the Chinese yuan and other international currencies over time, and accusations of protectionism by exchange rate manipulation. By and large, those arguments have subsided. Secondly, the debate at various stages has focused on China's desire to escape dollar domination through a long-term strategy of internationalizing the renminbi. However, China, having looked at the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s and looked afresh at its own national experience in its domestic financial crisis of 2015, at a political level have decided against any imminent or prospective possibility of opening the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, to a full float, or to liberalise China's capital markets, current account more broadly, capital account more broadly. China's reasoning behind that is it does not wish to cede any form of political sovereignty to external markets, particularly the operation of international hedge funds. So therefore, against that logic, China has made a domestic political choice that despite dollar domination of international financial markets, that it does not want to take the additional political risk of yielding its own currency to the international behaviour of currency markets, as this would affect their ability to manage their own economy. But the footnote to the above we should all pay attention to, and that is as follows. China is beginning to look at more unconventional ways in which it can deal with its continuing strategic concern with the country's exposure to potentially hostile currencies and China's own desire to expand its own global economic influence. We all know that Chinese commercial platforms like Alipay and WePay already dominate international e-commerce, generating some $9 trillion in payment transactions in the first quarter of this year alone. China wants to build on this strength by developing its own international digital currency. It also wants to prevent other potential international competitors like Facebook's Libra from securing serious first-mover advantage in the international marketplace. Indeed, Zuckerberg warned Congress in his recent testimony that unless the United States backed commercial efforts like Libra, America would indeed be ceding the global ground to China in this new and rapidly unfolding global race. China does not want its own international digital customers becoming tethered to a digitized currency that remains beyond China's own regulatory control and in fact remains regulated by the United States. So last week, China announced it would be adopting and licensing blockchain technologies in support of its own new proposed digital currency. to maximize security, full transparency, and central control. China's new cryptography law was just passed by the National People's Congress, coming into effect on 1 January next year, to support the release of the new digital RMB. This latest development has some potential to challenge the dollar over time as the global payment system progressively becomes digitized. These are very early days, but China senses a serious opportunity to reduce its global dollar dependency by leapfrogging the United States as an early adapter. Indeed, this may well become in time a new decoupling of the international financial settlement system. To conclude, if we look across the board, therefore, what can we see in this quick survey of the principal instruments of economic engagement? As you can see, the results are mixed. In trade, there will be new restrictions in technology exports, but China's overwhelming interest for the decade ahead is to maintain its export markets in America. And America, for different reasons, shares that overall objective. Foreign direct investment represents a different story where some level of decoupling of sorts has begun, albeit driven by other Chinese policy considerations as well. Decoupling may become more acute in technology markets, regulation and standards, in part because of America's national security concerns, in part because of China's desire to maximize national self-reliance. The story, as I've indicated, is quite different in capital markets, where the magnitude of mutual self-interest are militating in the reverse direction. And a more complex form of decoupling may emerge in the currency itself, where the full implications of China's recent announcements concerning new international digital currency are yet to be seen, but where we would be prudent to watch developments very carefully indeed. My concluding argument is that both governments should be very careful of what they wish for. Neither government formally embraces decoupling as policy, nor is decoupling, at least comprehensive decoupling, evident at this stage on the ground. But the warning signs are there. There is a danger that as each side assumes the worst about the other, that prudent contingency planning would require them to in fact prepare for decoupling by the other side. And again, we get back to what I began by talking about, the danger of mutually reinforcing actions eventually spiraling out of control. There is a narrow gap indeed between putting plans in place and the temptation bit by bit to give them operational effect. And then, without noticing it, we find ourselves in a completely different and indeed decoupled world. I thank you for your attention.
Well, there's a lot to mull over and chew on that you've given us. A few rays of hope, I guess, on trade. A much more worrisome trends on technology. And of course, this last dimension of a digital currency is fascinating. And of course, interests groups in both countries, as the mutual suspicion and sense of threat grows, can be counted on to exploit that for their own interests, as you sort of see Facebook doing in saying, well, we need Libra to compete with Alipay and Tencent Pay. And I think we can expect that kind of thing to continue. I'd like to step back and ask you just a couple of questions before we open it up to the audience. So, I've heard you describe Xi Jinping as agile, as a dialectician, meaning he can shift his policies depending upon what he thinks might be in his own interests or in the party's interests or China's interests. So that's a kind of pragmatism. And I want to ask you how the policies, the overreach of China during the Xi Jinping era that has provoked such a backlash in America and other countries, do you think that that pragmatism still governs Xi Jinping's future actions? Do you think that as the costs increase, we could expect to see some adjustments, or do you think he's kind of dug in based on some internal logic in his own mind or his own vision of the future?
I think Xi Jinping sees himself as a grand strategist. And the problem is with grand strategists is you don't know that it doesn't work until after it's failed. And so there are two things about his intellectual software I think it's important for us to understand. And this is in my own judgment. And he's quite unlike Chinese political leaders, at least going back to Mao. And the first is that for the last 40 years, you and I, Susan, have been looking at a succession of Chinese leaders, all operating within a similar conceptual framework, which is, yep, we're going to keep the Communist Party, but the only way in which the system survives is to open the economy, and to do that we need to fully engage the outside world, and long term that'll create a strong China. That's essentially been the script. If you dig deep into Xi Jinping, there are two other things which are actually shape his conceptual view of the world. And one is historical materialism and dialectical materialism. Now, before everyone goes to sleep, as to what that actually means, I had to go back and reread my sort of ancient university text to re-examine sort of certain Marxist fundamentals. But as a historical materialist, he sees China's place in historical evolution terms, and he sees China's overall trajectory as not just one of overwhelming strategic advantage at present, which is the internal analysis which the party undertakes, but that despite the fact that there are resistances and there are tactical problems along the road, that frankly the general trend is positive. Now we might say, what the hell does that mean? Understand that within a Marxist system, reaching, quote, an objective conclusion, 客观方面的结论, that this is as close as you get to revealed truth as possible. So there is a underlying view that China is still heading like that, and the corollary is, in this 战略性的机遇期 period of strategic opportunity, is that as China is doing that, America is doing this. That's the net assessment. Now within that, the other piece in his intellectual software as a dialectical materialist is this deep familiarity with action and reaction, and how do you best anticipate the unfolding of events. And there I think he is quite a master politician, actually, in the way in which he behaves, both in handling his internal party contradictions, but also in the need to, as it were, tactically adjust to pressures emerging within the economy and to pressures emerging in international relations. But these will at best be tactical adjustments. To go to the absolute core of what you've just asked about will he adjust now, the thing that surprised me most is that with the softening of the Chinese economy last year, beginning last year, that when I saw the measures announced at the end of last year to, as it were, change course, on appropriate market signals to support and encourage China's private sector, that those have not been sustained in a manner which makes a material difference. And the Chinese private sector is as unhappy now as it was 12 months ago, in fact, probably unhappier. Internationally, where you see the dialectical hand at work is this. The conclusion is that America is closing its doors, sooner or later, in one form or another. As I said in my remarks before, it's an uneven picture across the various elements of economic engagement. But the dialectician in him, and in the Chinese strategic community, says, well, if those doors are closing, we need to rapidly open other doors. And hence, if you look at the pattern of Chinese activist diplomacy, and I think agile diplomacy in Tokyo, in Delhi, and in Europe, and in a bunch of other places as well, as China is looking for major new, as it were, economic opportunities, capital market opportunities, technology market opportunities. If the American universities close down, then let's find a much greater number of European or British universities. So that's where I see him tactically at work.
But how does that fit with self-reliance? That's a bit of a contradiction, because you can't be just self-reliant vis-a-vis the United States. So there are a lot of, let's just take technology. You know, there's a lot of great technology being developed in Europe, in Australia and Israel, other places like that. So will self-reliance be a slogan, but the reality is new forms of interdependence with non-U.S. suppliers?
If I was to try and summarize in haiku form what China's, pardon the contradiction of this, because haiku is not Chinese, it's Japanese, what Xi Jinping's trying to do, it's self-reliance to the greatest extent possible, plus any major non-American we can woo into the China business, full stop. If I was trying to summarize what they're now seeking to do. And if you go to London, Berlin, Paris, you go to Tokyo, to Delhi, and you speak to the major interlocutors in those governments, that's what they report back.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions. Each person, please, just one question, and make it succinct. So, looking over here, just wait a sec. Okay, right over here.
Since it's just one question, answer either one of these. What
Yes and no.
What should the United States and other countries, Philippines, Vietnam, do with respect to the ever-increasing number of islands with military capability? Or, second question, pick your choice, what should the United States and others do with respect to the protein wars?
What are the protein wars?
The protein wars is a term mentioned by one of the speakers here, the former head of the U.S. Navy for the entire Pacific, and he's now an associate professor here.
Yeah, no, Robert Thomas, but
Okay, let me just
protein wars are China's ships 3,000 miles from China are trying to take over fishing territories of smaller islands that cannot protect themselves.
Okay.
I could show you the record of conversation with my conversations with PACOM 12 years ago when I warned them about this, but that would be gratuitous of me. But so I won't mention that. I think let me take the first question. And that is just briefly on the militarization of the South China Sea. What is happening at present is that China, through its Code of Conduct negotiations on the South China Sea, has managed to bring about a set of negotiating arrangements with the Southeast Asians, whereby the Southeast Asians do not believe they have any leverage to apply. That's where it's got to. Secondly, when the Southeast Asians look at Uncle Sam, they've reached a conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that the United States has begun to slowly slide out of the region. Thirdly, when they look for evidence of that, they will point to, for example, the upcoming East Asia Summit, where heads of government attend from each of the 18 East Asian states. The President of the United States is not going. He didn't go last year. Secondly, the Vice President of the United States is not going. Thirdly, the Secretary of State's not going. Wilbur Ross is going. Now, our friends in Southeast Asia, and I spend a lot of time in Singapore and Indonesia and places like that, they place a lot of importance on showing up. And the conclusion that the Southeast Asians are beginning to reach is that the nature of the, as it were, strategic game in Southeast Asia is fundamentally shifting in China's direction. That is my best sort of response to your question.
Okay. Yes, over here, right here.
Thank you for the question opportunity. So I wanted to ask, zooming out a little bit, we have looked at the trade war right now going on and at the financial crisis in 2008. At that time, America helped China and the whole world recover from the crisis in a way like collaborating. But that time, China's GDP was about 30% of America's. Now it's almost reaching 70%. In that context, are we looking at a bipolar world order, or are we going to look at a bipolar world order? Is the world becoming bipolar?
Well, it depends which domain we talk about. America remains the largest military power on Earth, both in conventional and at least comparable with the Soviet arsenal in terms of nuclear capabilities. China at this stage is not globally competitive with the U.S. military, but in terms of the specific military theatres in East Asia, it increasingly is. If you go to the detailed analysis of the scenarios which matter to the Chinese, which is what happens in and around Taiwan and what happens, let's call it, in the immediate East Asia, West Pacific geostrategic area, there would be enough consensus among Chinese and American military commanders to suggest that this is at least now highly contestable against a range of military scenarios. That's a military prism. If you're going to the economic prism, then frankly the equations vary. If we're looking at the future of, let's call it the internet or the Internet of Things, we might end up with a tripolar world. The United States with its own form of governance, the Europeans with their own form of governance, and the Chinese with state sovereignty at the center, having fun with the Russians and various participating BRI-type economies. In technology and artificial intelligence, it could well end up in a similar tripolar world as well, though with a question mark about what happens with Japan. So we're going to have what's referred to as literature as a whole bunch of variable geometries, and that's the nature of what we see unfolding.
Yeah. Yeah.
Richard Feinberg at GPS. Thanks for a really brilliant and comprehensive speech. So following up on the previous question, you mentioned that the Chinese are going around the world with their diplomatic offensive. How well is that being received? And a corollary to that, both Pence and Pompeo are going around the world warning about Chinese imperialism and how that should be resisted, the counterpart to the Chinese offensive. How well are those words being received as you travel around?
In this country, the United States, where I live and I work and I have done more or less since I left office, I've been around for about 4 or 5 years, I discover one thing often in Washington is that Washington likes to console itself with the thought that whatever China does in the world generates its own local reaction against China. Well, yes and no. is my observation in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean and the rest of Asia, the BRI countries. And what I see is a remarkable resilience in China's global diplomatic efforts, as when they run into difficulty, and the technical term in international relations theory is when they screw up, they go back home, dust themselves off, work out what went wrong, and they come back with a new approach.
Well, that's kind of an encouraging thing, isn't it?
Well, this is in terms of the maximization of Chinese global influence. What I see is China having much more success of an enduring nature than the United States is prepared to give them credit for. I've just come back from the Gulf. The Chinese presence at the Foreign Investment Initiative in Riyadh, where I was speaking on the future of the G20, the Chinese presence there was significant. China's, in the last 5 years, has become a dominant feature of long-term strategic planning, both by the Saudis and the Emiratis, in a way which was not the case several years ago. So what I see is China achieving relative degrees of success. It's never uniform. On the American side, my critique would be something like this. And I've said this as bluntly as I can to the US government. When you go around and say to your friends and allies around the world, okay, China bad, America good, and don't trade your security and your values for access to Chinese markets, which we say, okay, we got that. How about more access to your markets? That's American. Oh, we can't do that. We Americans don't believe in free trade anymore. We've exited the TPP. We killed TTIP, the parallel arrangement with the Europeans, the transatlantic. So here is the rub for American grand strategy. We get the message on security and values. Some of us have been working this in our own countries, dealing with China for 10, 15, 20 years. If you look at Australia's own exposures to China, for example. But guess what? You cannot go to the rest of the world and simply say, just love us because we're Americans, and no, you can't have any access to our markets. The single most stupid thing the Trump administration did was to kill the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Beijing couldn't believe its luck, okay? And here's the rub. It's in the prepared part of my text. The Chinese now have active working groups looking at how they can approach the TPP to join themselves. Now, this will freak out Japan and all the other American allies within the region, including Australia. But if China has got to the stage where it thinks long-term access to the American market is being shrunk over time, it may be prepared to accept a high-quality trade agreement of the type which the TPP represents, which 5 years ago Beijing wouldn't have touched with a barge pole. Apart from that, everything's going well.
We have a lot of young students here, both American students studying China and Chinese students coming from China. I want you to speak a little bit about the impact of these different degrees of decoupling in these different domains on the talents, on them. And what do you say to them to prepare for this uncertain future?
Again, in the prepared text that I'll distribute later in the week, there's a section dealing with talents which I did not speak to. For me, this is potentially the most serious of all, because it's people. We've forgotten that 40 years ago, it was exotic to be an American or a foreign student studying in China, or to be a Chinese student studying in America. This was quite unusual, because remember what happened in the 40 years before that. Mind you, if we went back to nationalist times, it was quite normal for there to be large numbers of Chinese students in America, if you go back to the 20s and 30s. Anyway, if I looked at the data carefully, overall Chinese enrollments in American universities went down 7% this year, 3% the previous year. It's the first time you've had double-year reductions. At the same time, Chinese student enrolments in the UK are increasing rapidly. Australia, I don't have the most recent numbers. I think the second point I'd make is it's been about 3 million, I think, Chinese students educated in American universities over the last 40 years. And about another 3 million combined if you put Canada, the UK and Australia together. By the way, about 80 or 90% of all students abroad study in the English-speaking countries. So if we suddenly start to turn the tap off, forget about the economic consequences and funding universities, forget all that. Let's just assume that those are problems that can be dealt with. I'm more concerned about where that leaves us in terms of real decoupling, because the consequences of that frighten me a lot. The final thing I'd say about America is simply this. You know, the impact in China over time of millions of returning Chinese students who have studied here and the rest of the English-speaking world is profound. These students and academics and then graduates and then those who run large corporations who are currently running major Chinese banks and whatever, they have an understanding, a sophisticated understanding of this country which cannot not otherwise be had or held. I worry intensely if we end up in several decades' time for those people almost to be like, you know, marooned assets, isolated in their own worlds. For those of you who are students now, I would say this game isn't up yet. We are just at the beginning of a big debate in America and the other English-speaking countries about how to handle the new challenges in all of our bilateral relationship with China. So I would not be running for the exit doors at this stage. I think there's a lot still to be debated, discussed and resolved. But I would caution all governments in the West and in China against using a blunt instrument on students. This would be the serious beginning of a radical decoupling with profound consequences for us all.
Yes, right here in the middle.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm curious on your take on how the U.S. China tension, as manifested through capital markets, financial flows, currency, trade war, affect the way Beijing approaches the Belt and Road Initiative and its ability to raise money both domestically and internationally to finance projects.
In Beijing, as many people will know, there's been some resistance to the Belt and Road Initiative around this principle. It costs a lot of money, and it sounds like a debate in Congress 10 years ago. Where's the money coming from? Now the debate in Congress is just keep those printing presses whirring, it's all fine. But in Beijing, it's kind of interesting. If you speak to the principal banks, they will quietly say to you, you know, the comrades at the centre need to understand that money doesn't grow on trees. And when you talk about a multi-trillion-dollar initiative, you know, the taxpayers have got to, you know, provide this cash. There used to be a debate out here in Washington, but now it's a debate in Beijing. Yes, right. Now it's a debate in Beijing. And secondly, because it's going to, quote, foreigners, what about my schools? What about my hospitals? What about the absence of services in my town just outside of Hangzhou? So, anecdotally, I'm simply reinforcing your point that there is a real discussion in Beijing about a more, quote, cost-effective Belt and Road Initiative. And it's been driven by, frankly, the concern over the effective use of public finance. What has China tried to do about that strategically? You would have seen the last Belt and Road conference in Beijing in July, I think, this year. I went to the first one. I went to the opening one and spoke. I didn't go to this one. But the attempt to, by China now to harness as much additional capital as it can from private capital markets or other participating governments is a reflection of, frankly, their concern about how big this thing potentially could become, and how draining on China's own domestic financial reserves it could become. If you're interested in a report on this, my colleague at the Asia Society in New York, Danny Russell, it's on our website, just did a 12-month audit report of the Belt and Road Initiative across finance, transparency, and green sustainability. And I think the Chinese, in fact, the Chinese government has indicated they appreciated the report, even though it was quite critical about a number of areas where they need to be more attentive to the fiscal efficacy of what they're doing, as well as transparency and sustainability.
So Danny Russell gave our other major endowed lecture here a few months ago, the So Kwan Luk lecture here.
It's good, yeah. Well, Danny's a great colleague. He's former Assistant Secretary East Asia, worked for the Obama White House, and has tried to control Australians for a long time. But that's an impossible mission.
Okay, we have time for, I guess, let's, 2 questions, one here and then the young woman in the back there.
I was interested in you talk about the decoupling of artificial intelligence. It seems to be leaving China to look for relationship. I'm particularly interested the one with Japan. With America withdrawing from the TPP, it seemed like the perception of withdrawing from East Asia. And Japan and China has, through its history, had a very tense relationship. But if they're able to work that out, particularly Japan feeling very isolated, is like it would in fact create a de facto situation in which America would be left out of East Asia. What do you have to say about that in terms of that relationship?
Rapprochement between China and Japan, with the U.S. being left out.
Well, obviously the fundamentals of the alliance relationship with Tokyo and the United States remain very strong. But secondly, Abe-san is highly intelligent. Abe-san looks carefully at American domestic politics. Abe-san looks carefully at the question of will President Trump be re-elected? What does that mean in terms of the future of American isolationism, strategic withdrawal? What does it mean in terms of alliance solidarity and support? Don't underestimate the emblematic effect of what just happened with the Kurds has had with American friends and allies around the world, as both the Europeans and the Asian allies are saying, what is America doing now and in the future? Now, Abe-san, in my judgment, is instinctively nationalist and pro-American with deep reservations about China. He's also a pragmatist, and he is, in my judgment, seeking to de-escalate tensions with Beijing, as China is with him, for the reasons I ran through before, and possibly preparing for a long-term future where, if America is uncertain about its future role in East Asia and the West Pacific, then it's far better that the China-Japan relationship is not with daggers drawn, but is of a different type altogether. Let me just back up one moment and say this. Your friends and allies, that America's friends and allies in the Asia-Pacific and your friends and allies in Europe, wish America to sustain its long-term global role. That is the overwhelming view. No one takes any pleasure at all among your friends and allies in the world about the possibility of the United States heading in the reverse direction. However, if allies and friends begin to form conclusions that you may incrementally be doing that over time, then allies and friends are unlikely to wish to remain isolated in such a world of the future. So ultimately this turns on what sort of America you want for the future, you the voters of the United States. And that's why all your friends and allies will be watching 2020 with more interest and engagement and commitment, not the Russian sort of commitment, that was really committed, than in any previous American election, because these questions are alive in every capital, allied capital in the world.
Okay, last question.
Thank you. Thank you for your insightful speech. So I am a naturalized American citizen originally from China. So I think I have some insight about Chinese people. So this year is 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, and I see outpouring, it's genuine people's pride of what the country has achieved in last 30 decades. As a overseas Chinese, I just recognize that although Chinese people, those elites or middle class who are beneficiaries of the Chinese reform, who have the power and voice currently, they admire Western values, democracy. However, they don't see themselves, the country moving towards democracy, because they think they don't want to follow former Soviet Union's model that I think they prefer stay in a cage. Now it becomes golden cage, but they prefer stay in a golden cage rather than a collapsed cage. So this decoupling, I see it's, so I hear the viewpoint among Chinese scholars here in the US that Trump is a president that Americans don't deserve, but China deserves. But I don't think, I don't think Trump administration thinking in that terms, but I do see this decoupling is also a result of value, the clash of different values. I think democracy, Western democracy versus autocratic values. So my question is, as a leading Chinese scholar and also a very experienced Chinese, politician, do you have faith in ultimately the democratic value, Western, will ultimately win over autocratic value? Of course, this is an infinite game. I don't think it's a finite. It's a, so if yes, under what kind of conditions? Thank you.
When you say win, do you mean globally or in China? Globally.
Well, that's a good, easy one to finish the session with. My belief is that the essential nature of the human condition is we all aspire to freedom, and we all aspire also to security. That's the nature of the human condition, whichever culture we happen to come from. I'm also always inspired by the work done by Eleanor Roosevelt and her team in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, where her co-drafters were not a bunch of guys from the State Department, but were leading Chinese and Indian academics and scholars and officials, drawing upon multiple civilizational traditions. Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judeo-Christianity, etc. And what you therefore see distilled in the Universal Declaration of 1948 was a view of what constituted fundamental human values and rights, including the right to democratic assembly, from all those traditions. That's my view as well. We need to stop in the West describing them as Western values. These are universal values. China also, albeit in the nationalist period, signed and ratified the Universal Declaration. China in the post-49 period signed, but hasn't yet ratified, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The best form of engagement with our Chinese counterparts on these questions is not selective examples taken from the events of the day, but to engage China and all countries on the basis of our undertakings under those two international covenants. They reflect our formal, official conclusions as nation states as to what we believe. In China itself, my reflection would be, when I speak with young people, and I speak at a lot of universities around China, I don't find the kids there much different to kids at Harvard and where I speak as well, or Yale, or here, or elsewhere. Kids aspire to becoming themselves, having freedom in their lives. They all want a good job. They all want to travel the world. I don't see kids being much different. And I'm not sure that whatever ideology is presented to them by whichever political system ultimately has much sway over that. In terms of what ultimately prevails, the Chinese Communist Party has its own view of that. It regards itself as representing the dictatorship of the proletariat. It represented itself as internally having a form of people's democracy organised under the principles of what they describe as democratic centralism. And it seeks to redefine the term democracy itself, as you know, Susan. The Communist Party will continue to argue that. I'm not sure the country at large will continue to have that view over a long period of time. But ultimately, the truth of this will become manifest as this generation of young Chinese eventually assume positions of leadership as well. My final point is this. The greatest challenge in all of this is the, let's call it the traditional, quote, Western democracies, losing confidence in themselves, losing confidence in their own democracies, losing confidence in their own values, losing confidence in what Eleanor Roosevelt put into writing back in 1948. The danger for us is becoming such a, self-absorbed, post-modernist society, concerned with how we all feel of a morning and whether we've got our cosmic karmic self perfectly in order, rather than these basic elemental principles that countless generations of women and men in multiple cultures fought for in order to become the norms of what we constitute, what we believe to be a valid set of values for the future. If we become so lazy and so self-indulgent that we no longer think these things are relevant, well, we deserve everything that history can throw at us. But I'm confident that young folks actually are not that lazy. I think when I see contemporary activism on climate, for example, which is in pursuit of a global sense of responsibility and values of sustainability, and the freedoms which give rise to the ability to argue those propositions, I do not see young people as being irrelevant to this at all. I'm concerned more about the current political class, and that worries me a little about where the torch of freedom and democracy goes.
Well, thank you so very much for really a tour de force of deep analysis about the present and future of U.S. China relations. And just as sometimes you go to a concert and you hear a great piece of music and then you want to go home and listen to the recording to get more deeply into it, I think we'll all look forward to reading the speech as well as listening to it here. So thanks very much. We look forward to your next visit, maybe for the Forum on U.S. China relations this winter. Thank you.